opportunity to do so. Well, we've got a major problem with our own world ecosystems and water supplies and food supplies, quite independent of climate change. As climate change starts biting, those will get worse. I think the sort of general wealth that we're used to, I don't see that recovering. I don't see that we're likely to bounce through this minor blip, as people talk about it, or significant recession back into, unless we change, into a happy and prosperous future economically. I think food is going to start becoming short, and I don't think that's necessarily going to be restricted just to poorer nations. You know, we find it hard to meet the food needs of the population already. And when one gets major impacts, let's suppose we have really major droughts or floods affecting European and world wheat crops, a large number of people would be deprived of staple foods. And if you start doing that even in a Western nation when people are already feeling financially squeezed, then that's a recipe for big problems. So I see increasing starvation, I see increasing poverty, and I see increasing conflict arising from these things. And actually, those are all health issues. Health around the world has always been driven by poverty and starvation and conflict, not just by malaria and diarrhea and so forth. Things that we concentrate on CO2, of course, but there are a whole raft. Neither, oddly enough, do I want to stand there and throw stones at fossil fuel industry particularly. They are where they are, and they have a responsibility to shareholders to make money. We need to help them make their money in a different way, and we need to do that aggressively in urgency. If we just harangue them without offering them that other market, we can't expect them to change. It's unreasonable to expect them to change. But we do assist them in making that change.
Everybody knows about forests and the importance of deforestation for climate change. So everybody knows about it at this climate summit. That policy to reduce from deforestation. But few people know about the emissions from peats, the material area where the plant material falls in the water in oxygen low acid water and remains there for hundreds and thousands of years. This peat is now having huge. There is more carbon stored in peat than twice the amount that is stored in the forest of the whole world, 70% atmosphere. So if this is released, we have a real big problem. Well, the bad news is it's now rapidly decomposed, mines, and is converted into carbon dioxide. So we are facing a disaster. Globally, 3 tons carbon are released every year. 3,000 megatons of carbon dioxide every year again. That is 11% of the total amount of all global fossil fuel emissions. That is enormous. This amount is increasing rapidly because in many areas of the world the swamp areas are drained to enable logging for the timber, to enable agriculture, to enable, for instance, in Southeast Asia, pulp plantations and palm oil plantations, crops that can't stand water. So they drain the area to enable the agriculture, and by draining it, oxygen low water disappears, and the peat that was stored like pickled onions is just exposed to the air and will react. Carbon in the peat will react with the oxygen in the air to carbon dioxide. And this is taking place very rapidly, especially in the tropics. Especially Southeast Asia is notorious for this. Only from Indonesia, 2/3 of all those emissions are released every year, 2,000 megatons. Because Indonesia is cutting down its swamp forests, its rainforests and peatlands. They drain the area to enable equipment to enter the area, to lock the trees, to take out the Meranti and Ramin trees for our furniture. After that, often the same companies continue the drainage, and they drain the area till 1 meter deep to establish plantations for palm oil, for instance. Palm oil used as a biofuel in many Western countries and subsidized as a green, environmentally friendly biofuel, is produced in under those plantations with a drainage of a depth of 1 meter. We see that every year 10 centimeters is just evaporating in the form of carbon dioxide. If you look at the 1 hectare, this is an emission of 100 tons of carbon dioxide from every hectare every year after year, till all the peat is disappeared. This is of course a disaster. This 100 tons of carbon dioxide are just released to enable a palm oil plantation that just produces 6 tons of palm oil a year. 6 tons of palm oil a year, but the production cost dioxide. This is not a green fuel. It is worse than mineral oil. It is worse than coal. It's worse than anything. So countries should stop supporting those biofuels. Countries in the Western world should support countries like Indonesia to maintain and manage their peatland areas very well, because those carbon stocks are too precious and countries really should give money to the communities in poor regions in the peatlands to manage their areas in a way so they can keep the carbon in the soil. That is a global problem, and you can't expect a poor local community to solve this problem.
Good morning, my name is Nyoman Surya Diputra. I'm the Technical Director of Events International Indonesia. So currently we have a project, something related with the rehabilitations of the mangrove habitats in Aceh. So Aceh, one of the countries in the Asian countries, have been affected severely during the tsunami. So in Aceh we are working together with Indonesia, and this project funded by Oxfam Novib, Netherlands. Yeah. So we started the project in year 2005 in August, and it will be last in December 2008. So far up to now, we've planted already almost 2 million mangrove seedlings, also including the beech tree species, which is Casuarina. So from 2 years working in Aceh coastal areas up to now, to sequester almost 12,000 tons of carbon dioxide. So hopefully in the coming years, more carbons will be sequestered because the plant keep growing up. So that is about Aceh. In Aceh, we are working with the local community which were affected by the tsunami. Yeah. So we provide them with a small grants. Yeah. So they can start it with our small grant to start their livelihood. But at the same time, we were asking them to plant mangrove seedlings and also the beech tree species. Yeah? So the project will last until next year. So the second thing I would like to raise here, it is about the peatland. Peatland, Indonesia has the largest tropical peatland all over the world. Yeah? We have almost 21 million hectares of peatland. And our peatland stored so much carbon, even though the above ground of the vegetation is already degraded. So the below ground carbon that we calculated already, it was about 125 gigatons of equivalent carbon dioxide. So we urge very much that the people attending these conventions to really take care about peatlands, of the tropical peatlands. Yeah, so we have problems annually because of this kind of pit fires, because of the drainage, yeah, because of the illegal loggers activities, and then we have problems with the pit fire. And then according to the recent findings, our peatland emitted so much carbon, mainly from the burning, about 1.4 gigatons of carbon dioxide emitted annually because of the fire. And then currently, in Central Kalimantan, we have a project called Central Kalimantan Peatland Project. And the project carried out together with the consortium, University of Palangkaraya, WWF, CARE International, and also with the local government. Yeah? And then from that project, we tried to rehabilitate the peatlands by blocking the canals. By blocking the canals, actually we tried to rise up the groundwater table. By rising the groundwater table, we tried to keep the peatland wet. So by keeping the peatlands wet, that means the peatlands will be very difficult to get fire. We do hope that we can save a lot of carbons during the dry seasons.
And quite correctly, I think about the impact of ideas on actions and on our culture and society as a whole. I want to look for a few minutes at where we get our ideas and how we might change them. What underlies the fact that we are having a conference on ecology where the major nation of the West, along with its allies in large part, the people whose minds we cannot change. How is it that it is so impossible to make states, for instance, understand the crisis we're in and their relationship to the rest of it? I want to look then at Western ideas, religious ideas, and how those religious ideas are affecting both our economic principles and our scientific choices. Jonathan Edwards wrote once, "Saints do not see things others do not see." On the contrary, saints see just exactly what everyone else sees, but they see it differently. What does the West see? And how do they see it? That brings them into meetings like this and puts them in tension with what seems to be so commonly conscious to so much of the world. As Richard said, we know the situation. We know that we are in a period where what we see is a vast and complicated and crucial and obviously skewed world around us. We're losing, talk about asking animals and trees for forgiveness because we need to cut down a tree to build a house. We are destroying an average of 200 million animals a year for research on cosmetics. We're too hungry of this world for whatever reasons, because the earth isn't producing or there are no trees there. 2/3 of the hungry of this world are women. 2/3 of the illiterate of this world are women. And 2/3 of the poor of the world are women. That can't be an accident. That has to be somebody's policy or philosophy of life, that this is a part of the world last, house last, educate last, and free last. Where do we get ideas like that? How could we possibly live in this society and say there's something reasonable about that? We can rupture the placenta of the earth and sit back and not worry. We can watch the polar ice cap going and change the channel because it has nothing to do with us, and we can send our delegates to meetings like this, and we will go on choosing long-term profits over, or short-term profits over long-term treaties. We're using chemicals, oil, and they're now depleting that land as well as poisoning the water that we need to grow those things. We talk about security, and we're using and creating nuclear weaponry designed to destroy. We have the effrontery, the arrogance to call that defense. How do you do that and then trumpet treaties that have left the annihilation industry completely intact? What we have managed to eliminate is 1% of the nuclear world, and yet we don't see trouble. If those are the ideas that we are throwing into the universe, no wonder we have had conferences on climate. Not because we don't have the scientific data, but because the ideas that we are formed in the West have got to be changed. Now, I'm going to argue that these ideas are intellectual ideas. They are not simply spiritual ideas. They have spiritual impact, but they don't come out of our best spiritual of the cosmos. And yet, we are in a world where, in my country, in a world filled with the obscenely poor, we are also filled with churchgoers. Now, there's got to be a disconnect between what we say is the spiritual life and what we assume is also the civic life into which or out of which we build our spiritual concepts. We haven't reached the point, clearly, of seeing differently. I'm not sure that we are really at the point, however many conferences we've had, as a people, of seeing at all. There was an essay written in 1960 by Lynn White Jr. The name of the essay is the Historical Roots of the Ecological Crisis. That essay was perceived as a kind of theological heresy. It is now taken, it's a classic in the development of theological thought. What did Lynn White say that shook the religious world? White wrote, "The major problem facing the modern world is that the Judeo-Christian ethic justifies." The major problem facing the modern world is that the Judeo-Christian ethic justifies domination. In other words, White was saying that what people do or fail to do about ecological issues depends on what they have been taught to think about creation, about themselves, and about their relationships to the things around them as a result of their thinking about the nature of God. So, for instance, if water has no meaning except for my comfort as a human being, dam it up and drain it off, I can drown it in oil and waste and tin cans, chokes the fish and poisons the children without even having so much as the grace to blush. And that is precisely what we do. We have not just separated ourselves from nature. That would be some sort of civic fault line. We have distinguished ourselves from nature, but more than that, we have made nature our product to manipulate. We have taken the ownership of nature. We don't see it. Now, the question is why. I believe that the religious foundation for this problem in the Western world, as you move from one of these meetings to another, lies in the fact that the Western world, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, has chosen to choose one creation story over another. Like most religions, there's more than one creation story in Western theology. The one most of you would know, I bet, if you raised your hands, is one you learned in Sunday school someplace about Adam and Eve. They're put in the garden, and the ancient tradition said, or translation says, to fill the earth and subdue it. Why are we here? What's our purpose? To fill the earth and subdue it, to take it and keep it, to keep it and steward it, to have it and use it. As a result, with that attitude that we are here to subdue the earth, we begin by losing balance. We have forfeited our spiritual perspective. You can't sit around in a room and talk about spiritual perspective on the one hand when you are feeding it with some sort of theological barriers or obstacles to the spiritual life and the sustenance of the earth itself. We have put ourselves, in other words, this most religious people, in spiritual peril. When you realize that, you realize then that the Judeo-Christian ethic is, as a matter of fact, the most anthropocentric, the most human-centered of all religions. It begins centering on the creation of humanity. They didn't talk about the flowers. The first day this, the second day that, the third day this, the fourth day that, and then you. Now we got to what counts. Now we got to what's going to do it right. Here sits the crown of creation. I am looking at it. Then it proceeds by glorifying it, and it ends with concern solely with the redemption of humanity. There is never any talk about what will happen to the earth, except that it will burn up, blow away, but you and I will stay. Those ideas are very clear. We teach that creation is a series of stages and that each one is higher than the one before it. When you teach that, if you allow that idea to seep into its most logical viewpoint, you're saying then that humanity outranks the universe in splendor and achievement. Whatever you do is enough. This is God's answer. Secondly, we say, man, the male, is the crown of creation. We have built a pyramid, and up here sits the male. Now we know that's true because men have told us so. There isn't any doubt about how this system goes together. We've got somebody at the top of it whose rationality has brought us to this point. Whose rationality has brought us to this point. So if a woman weeps over it, if a woman cries about it, if a woman aches about it, we say women are like that, they're unreasonable. 3, we say God planned the world for human benefit. It's just this big cornucopia of Thanksgiving gifts, and you can have as many as you want. It's all there for us. Its purpose, the whole purpose of the planet itself is to sustain our creature comforts. And we can, it's eternal. It will always keep producing for us. That's what its purpose is. What are we worrying about? This is a blip. This is a blip on the cosmological screen. This is just a little temperature change. This is for us. Nothing bad is going to happen to it. Number 4, we teach we own nature. We're it belongs to us. And so finally, number 5, we say the function of this earth is to serve man's purpose, whatever that scope, whatever the end of it. That means then that we can now assume with confidence that humans are above nature. We're not nature. We're beyond nature. Despite the fact that as the top of the food chain, we'll be the first to go if pollution continues at the rate you can measure it tonight. Well, it's a neat picture. It's a tidy picture, but it's very partial in a world in which 30% of us consume 80% of the world's resources and somehow or other diminish the rest of the human race. That was the first creation story. There's a second one. Now the interesting part of ecclesiastical gossip here is that the second one was really the first one. Somebody along the line put this second one first. I have a funny feeling it was for their economic advantage then, too. Second creation story. You remember this one, too. This is where Scripture says, the Judeo-Christian Scripture says, God brought the animals to Adam for naming. Remember that one at all? That was hardly touched. It's hardly ever preached from a pulpit in the West. It's almost never exegeted. But when they do exegete it, they say, now what this means is that by giving the human being the right to name the animals, that's the sign that the human being got power over the animals. I love asking a lay audience, how many in here have children? Anybody in here have children? Did you name any of them? Did you get any power? No, you bet you didn't. You get a little less power every single day. I don't care what you named them. The whole notion that it's a sound theological exegesis to say that this was simply another way of proving that the human being has power over every other living creature has got to be at least a certain degree of nonsense. So we have then a story in which the animals are brought to Adam, I would argue, to indicate the relationship between the human being and nature. The honest-to-God, caring, loving, responsible relationship. You don't name animals that you take into your family. The animal that you take into your family becomes part of your family. You take responsibility for that animal. You develop personal relationship. You would indeed say to that animal, if you had to kill it, thank you for what you've done. It breaks my heart to take this. but I know that this is the connection between us, and that you would give your life for me. You have two creation stories. The first is the story that explicates a theology of domination. It's all yours. Do anything you want to with it. Argue at every COP conference. Tell all of the smaller nations that this is your decision. You bought the mine. You own the diamonds. You'll get the oil. They're all yours. The second creation story gives you the theology of relationship, of responsibility, of ownership and care and love and sustenance and for an eternal understanding. It's beginning then to move your churches, to move your scriptures, to move your own minds, to teach your own children, to see that this theology of domination is what really is the spiritual demon in resistance in this conference. And until churches begin to emphasize not simply recycling, but God's purpose in putting us into relationship with nature, we're not going to change any minds. That legislation won't hold up. You'll be having COP conferences until your great-great-grandchildren are coming. COP 1762, and nothing has happened yet. Somehow or other, if we're going to be spiritual people, if we have any respect whatsoever for the way God works with humankind and the word that God has given all of us in our scriptures, then it's time to look up the second story. It's time to see what it says about eating organically, about what it says about not destroying the earth, about what you have in front of you. It is not a theology of domination. We have to choose between these two. And we have to know that the one is reckless and the second one is relational. Saints do not see what people do not see. Saints see just what everybody else sees, but they see it differently. It's time for us to open up our scriptures, open up our churches, open up our spiritual counseling groups, and begin to see who we are a little different. Because if we don't get this story, we're going to be the first ones to go. That your presence here is a sign of grace. It's a sign of holiness. It's a sign of goodness breaking. It's a sign of this call of God in the human heart. Find your second creation story and yourself in it. And the Lord will say, you're not going to do this with science. You're not going to do it with math. You're not going to do it with oil. You're not going to do it with money. You can only throw the thought out into the universe that we are to be in a love affair. The nature of God, the nature of creation, the nature of our relationships, the nature of the cosmos. Theology process. Spirituality is the way we choose to live because of what we believe. Now you see a lot of threat in the major religious traditions because they don't like people using the word spirituality. Spirituality says, I don't know if you're thinking what you ought to think. So until or other, the theological basis for what we do, somehow or other we talk about sustainability of the earth. We have to sustain a spirituality that is an earth-centered spirituality because that is our obligation to the creation. Theology is not you can just throw away. It's a dangerous subject, a wonderfully dangerous subject, because it changes hearts and minds. But you've got to look at the one you were given and decide if your theology and your thoughts about science are relative. Do they match?
In one of the discussions or workshop I attended, somebody made the remark that if climate was a bank, it would have been rescued a long time ago. And I think that it's a very crude remark, but it really sums up what is valued in the society. that we, the West, everybody preaches about that we're on this catastrophic path, but no one is willing to sacrifice anything. But we're willing to come up with money out of thin air to save banks, 600 billion and plus others. So I think it really speaks to how do we get that shift in awareness? How do we get the masses of people to really come to grip with this, about our miscalculation or evaluation of what is important, what is essential to life, and what it is that we need to actually save and give up to save what we value, what we say we value.
Yes, I really mean it. You know, I honestly mean it, that I believe religion legitimates. When you accept as your creation story a story about domination, and you define domination as your spiritual purpose and reason for existence. Nobody's going to use that word in so many terms, but when you say fill the earth and subdue it, that's what you're talking about. I want to know, I think you need to go to the UN designers and definers of COP16 and ask them, why is this the only conference in my memory on this subject that introduced even the notion of the relationship between spiritual ideas, scientific ideas, cosmic ideas, and economic ideas. I think you ought to be having conferences for pastors, writers, preachers, and teachers, and ask them how they are dealing with this topic. Churches are staying away from this topic like it's a plague. They'll tell you, well, that's not our question. That's a political problem, or it's a scientific problem. No, it's not. Every one of these speakers tonight have told you it's a spiritual problem. And I'm not sure this is coming through the churches at all. I think that we have to call the churches to their own responsibility to deal with this topic as a spiritual question, and then when and I don't mean to imply that you do it first and you hold everything else, but until we see the two, all we're doing, all this conference is doing, is maintaining the notion that the two things are separate, and they're not. Until the spiritual religious community as a community comes on board across all traditions and says, this is what our scriptures are about, and this is what we say, you are not going to know why you can't get people to agree on these issues.
Hi there, I'm really happy to be here today to tell you about one of the impacts climate change is having in the ocean that really hasn't had as much focus as I wish it and I hope it will have in the future. So climate change has three impacts in the ocean. It causes the oceans to warm, it causes them to become more acidic, so decrease in pH, and it also causes them to lose oxygen. And so today I'll be focusing on the loss of oxygen from the oceans. And we know that scientifically as ocean deoxygenation. And so the ocean actually takes up more than 90% of the heat that's produced from anthropogenic CO2 emissions. And when the ocean warms, it has some really important consequences, like deoxygenation. And unfortunately, this is a fairly new problem. Even scientists have only started addressing it in the last 20 years. And so it hasn't received quite as much attention. But oxygen is fundamental for most life. We breathe oxygen, fish breathe oxygen through their gills. Pretty much all of the organisms you see in that coral reef require oxygen to live, and so oxygen is very fundamental. However, climate change actually causes oxygen levels in the ocean to decrease, and that's mostly due to warming. And we've actually seen that in the data. Globally, we have seen that the oceans are losing oxygen, and we've already seen biological consequences of this oxygen loss, because again, oxygen is very important to support life. And the groups that are most sensitive to loss of oxygen are actually fish and crustaceans. So crustaceans being our crabs and our lobsters. So these are the groups that are really important for our fisheries. And so that's why a lot of countries should actually be interested in what's going on with oxygen loss on their coastlines and in the open ocean. And so let's just take a moment and take a breath and think about what's in the air that we just inhaled. So about 21% of the air that you just inhaled is oxygen. And as Carol Turley will tell you, there are 2 lungs on this planet. One of the lungs is the terrestrial lung, and it's producing about half of the oxygen, and the other lung is our ocean lung. That's all of the algae that grow in the oceans, and that's producing 50% of the oxygen we breathe. So a lot of the oxygen that we're getting is actually coming from all of these small phytoplankton in the ocean. In the ocean, there is oxygen, but it's there in a dissolved form, and it's much harder to get out of the water for marine organisms that live in there. And oxygen content in the ocean is dependent on the temperature, the amount of mixing that's occurring at the surface, and then the biology. So biology produces oxygen through photosynthesis, and it uses up oxygen through respiration. So we respire, and all of the organisms in the ocean also respire, thereby using oxygen. And climate change has a negative impact on all 3 of these. And so we'll just do a little intuition building so we can all become comfortable with why climate change would negatively impact oxygen levels in the ocean. So first of all, warm water holds less oxygen. We can do many experiments in the lab. It's a very simple physical property, and we see that when temperature increases, the amount of gas that water can hold decreases. And so because of that, just simply when you warm the water, it's going to be able to hold less oxygen. And we can actually see this in the lab, but then we can actually see this in the data from the ocean, where the tropics in light purple are areas with low oxygen, and the tropics are the areas with the lowest oxygen at the surface, because warm water can simply hold less oxygen, whereas polar regions have higher oxygen content just because of the property that cold water can hold more oxygen. And then warm water is harder to mix, so when you get warming at the surface from climate change, it becomes more difficult to mix that water. When you can mix more water, you can get more oxygen into the water from the atmosphere. When you can mix less water due to that warming, you get a stratified water column. That means that everything outside of that mixed layer is no longer in contact with the atmosphere. And a lot of biological respiration is going on at those mid-depth levels. So if you can't mix the oxygen in there, it's going to get depleted much more rapidly. Another reason why warming leads to more oxygen use is because when it's warmer, you actually breathe more, you respire more, you use more oxygen. And so that's what's going on in the ocean with all of the organisms that live there. The ocean is full of bacteria, so there are about 1 million bacteria in every milliliter of seawater, and all of those bacteria are utilizing oxygen. So that, and when the temperatures increase, you also get increased respiration. And so a lot of times you get increased respiration in areas where there's high productivity. So whenever you have a big algae bloom, for example, and once the algae bloom sinks out of the water column, it gets decomposed by all of those bacteria, and that leads to a reduction in oxygen. So whenever you get increased nutrients, whether that's through sewage runoff or fertilizer runoff, or whenever you get increased nutrients due to upwelling, so coastal circulation, nutrient-rich water coming up, you're going to be in a situation where you have high surface productivity and then more decomposition at depth. And so coastally we have a lot of hypoxic areas. So hypoxia is simply defined as an oxygen concentration that's detrimental to life. So in most areas, most organisms can't live in a hypoxic zone. Some are specifically adapted for it, but most animals can't live in those areas. And so in red you can see all of the coastal hypoxic zones. There are more than 400 identified now, and so these usually correspond to areas with dense populations. And so these are primarily driven by a lot of nutrient runoff from our farms, from sewage, and so most parts of the world with dense population have these coastal hypoxic zones. And so if you actually go on Google Earth and you go into Google Ocean, you can take a look to see all of the hypoxic areas that have been identified in your own area. So that's us at the National Stadium, and you can see the Baltic Sea actually has quite a few hypoxic zones. There are also open ocean low oxygen zones. We call these oxygen minimum zones. And they're naturally occurring there because we have really nutrient-rich water at the surface, and once we have high productivity at the surface and it sinks down and gets decomposed, it utilizes a lot of the oxygen. And so we have these large oxygen minimum zones, particularly in the Pacific. And so in this map, everything that's not gray is a part of the ocean that has hypoxic waters. And so we see really large areas of that in the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, and then we also have hypoxic areas off of the west coast of Africa. And so where these hypoxic zones actually butt up against the continental margins, that really impacts our fisheries because a lot of our fisheries target the continental margins. And these are large areas where most fish that we like to fish can't live. And so the total hypoxic area on the continental margins, so a lot of the places we like to fish, it's greater than the area of Poland and France combined. So you're really talking about large areas where most fish that we like to fish can't live. And so not only are they large in area, they're about 8% of the total ocean area, but they're also very deep. So you can have parts of the ocean where you can have 1,000 meters of water that's hypoxic, which can't support most normal aerobic life. And so one of the main points is that this is a very widespread problem, and probably whether you have a coastal hypoxic zone due to runoff or you have an oceanic zone due to your or an oceanic low oxygen zone due to your location, most coastlines actually have a low oxygen problem. And this low oxygen problem gets exacerbated when you experience surface warming because of the properties of how warming affects oxygen content in water. And so we've actually seen in our data that there has been a decrease in oxygen, and the new assessment IPCC Assessment 5 report actually predicted that by the end of the 21st century you'll see a 3 to 6% decline in global oxygen levels in the ocean. But this is just an average value, and so what you actually see in this graph, in the blue, on the top panel in the blue, you see areas that are already low in oxygen, and then in the second panel, in the blue, you see the areas that are going to lose the most oxygen and have lost oxygen already. And what you can see is that the areas that are already limited on oxygen are the ones that are losing the most oxygen. And so that's important. And you can actually see the expansion of these low oxygen areas through the water column. So between 1960 and today, you can see that the depth occupied by these low oxygen hypoxic areas in the water have expanded. And so what that means for us on the coastlines is as these areas expand, they also shoal, so they become shallower. They get closer to our coasts, and our coasts now actually face this low oxygen water that is coming up and affecting some of the fish. And we've seen off of the coast of California in the last 22 years a 21% decrease in mean oxygen content at about 300 meters, and coastally a shoaling of about 100 meters of the hypoxic layer. And so where the depth of the hypoxic layer is what really affects a lot of your coastal organisms. And so what we can see when we look at physiology in the lab is that there are certain groups that are most sensitive to low oxygen. And we can look at this in terms of lethal concentrations, and so what causes an organism to die, or we can look at this with sublethal concentrations, so what causes an organism to grow less or to reproduce less. And we can see that for both of these, crustaceans and fish are our most sensitive groups. And we can see that in the lab, but we can also see that in the field. We have mortality events, large mortality events in the Gulf of Mexico. When you get a hypoxic area, you have a low oxygen event, you have dead fish. This is a really fast impact. We also see that off of the coast of Africa where there's low oxygen water that shoals. Crustaceans, lobsters will just walk out of the ocean because the oxygen is too low for them, and you'll have a widespread mortality event. And so we can see this most recently off of Oregon, where before the Oregon coastline did not have a lot of anoxic and hypoxic events, but recently, since 2002, because of the shoaling of this oxygen minimum zone and this low oxygen water, they've actually been experiencing a lot more low oxygen mortality events. And starting in 2002, they saw 75% mortality of the Dungeness crab, which is a really big, important fishery off of Oregon. And then also in these ROV surveys, you can see a healthy fish community prior to 2002, and then pretty much all of their ROV surveys after 2002 saw a lot of dead fish and invertebrates along the bottom because of these low oxygen events. And so what that means for the greater ocean, it results in habitat expansions and contractions. So there's some organisms that actually really like low oxygen because they've been adapted to it through evolutionary time. So this fish on the right actually does great with very low oxygen concentrations. And so organisms like that will see their range expand. But organisms that need high oxygen to survive, and so those are our tunas, our billfish, they actually are experiencing habitat contraction because all of a sudden they can't use as much of the water column as they did previously. And so we've already seen a 15% reduction in the habitat of tuna in the Atlantic because of the expansion of these low oxygen areas. There's also been a decline in mesopelagic fish. So these are small midwater fish that are really a very important component of the food web. They feed everything at the top levels of the food web, and so they're very sensitive to low oxygen. And then also we've seen habitat expansion of the Humboldt squid. So the Humboldt squid can do well in low oxygen conditions, and it actually has expanded all along the west coast of the US. And they compete with hake, and they also eat hake. So the hake fishery has not been doing as well, but the fishery on Humboldt squid has been doing better. And so a really important point is that low oxygen areas are carbon dioxide maximum areas. Whenever you use oxygen, you produce carbon dioxide. That's just through respiration. And so whenever we see an area that's low in oxygen, it's always high in carbon dioxide. So when we see the shoaling of these low oxygen areas, we actually see the shoaling of very low pH water. And so that's exactly what we've been seeing off of the west coast of the United States, where some of the water that's coming up is 7.6, 7.75, very, very low pH. And what that also means is it has very high CO2 concentrations. And so some of these waters are 1200, and for example, surface is 400 parts per million. And so this is actually water that is net fluxing carbon dioxide out of the water instead of taking it up. So there are some important feedback implications. So we really need to pay attention to ocean deoxygenation because it has very important biological effects. We know that it's declining, and we know that it will decline in the future with surface warming. And we know that it probably will have some important impacts for a lot of coastal economies. However, because it's such a new topic, it really hasn't had too much of a focus, and it didn't make it into the summary for policymakers, even though it's really a problem policymakers should be thinking about because it can impact their local economies. And so small changes in temperature can have very drastic impacts on oxygen content. So just a 1 degree increase in surface warming will triple your suboxic zones and increase your hypoxic areas by 10%. We know that it has profound consequences on biodiversity, on fisheries income, and we know that it also has environmental feedbacks in terms of greenhouse gas emissions because a really potent greenhouse gas, nitrous oxide, is produced in low oxygen areas. And in the historic record, we actually see that oxygen depleted areas in the ocean are very tightly correlated with warming periods. So we know how this works in the past. And so with that, I would just like to say thank you for listening to this presentation. And I'm here as a part of a group of Scripps students. We're graduate students, and we really want to try and communicate our research to more of a public policy audience as well as a public audience. And so there's more information about how climate change is affecting the oceans at this website, oceanscientist.org. And also there's an oceans booth here, 102 on this floor. So if you have any other questions about ocean impacts of climate change, please come and talk to us. So thank you.
One of the biggest responsibilities to carry when you consider the human development and the effects of human development, when you consider urbanization, population growth, the need for further and further and further development, and when you acknowledge that sort of the resources that are being consumed, wasted through construction, demolition processes, all of this, and you consider energy and climate change and carbon, etc., through the architects has changed in profile. There is no longer that kind of art for art's sake. We actually have a greater responsibility, and whilst the need for art is there, and make no mistake, there's, our cities need to reflect, they need to reflect our society, they need to reflect what is good about human creativity and nature. There is another layer of thinking that has to be brought to architecture in this current world, in these days now, which is a very much a social and an environmental responsibility that cannot be shirked and has to be addressed. And I just want to convince as many young up-and-coming architects as possible to think about architecture as a very important role player in the world going forwards in terms of that responsibility, both in an artistic sense and a scientific sense in terms of performance and everything else. You know, there's an old modernist architecture axiom that talks about form follows function, and I prefer to think in terms of form follows flow. And I think about that in terms of the way the sun energy flows across a site, the way wind flows across a site, water, even people, even money, even all sorts of things. So one can sort of underpin a design in its social, economic, environmental context by considering the various different energies that are flowing and how to harness the power within that in order to generate architectural form and meaning. So you know, it's very much context-based. So I teach, and what I try to impress upon my students is that there's kind of three role players, in essence, in the architect's visualization or understanding of a project, and that would be the physical context of the project, so the piece of the planet whereupon it's going to happen, whether that be urban, rural, or whatever. That piece of earth will have various different attributes and sort of qualities about it. Then there's the brief or the program or the client of the project, and their needs out of the project is a very big design driver that architects can actually use to generate form, obviously. And then there's the architect themselves and what they bring to that process in terms of their identity, their worldview, their philosophies, their creative impulses. So it's sort of a very nice process whereby I see the architect as kind of like a matchmaker between a piece of ground and a client with a need, but that matchmaking happens through a very personal engagement with the project by the architect, bringing their own sensitivities to that project. We have a world now, and we have this thing called climate change, and the reality is that 40% of climate change is actually caused by architects. 40% of the world's energy is used in the operation and maintenance and production of buildings. So I point the finger at architects and I say it's your fault. And then I understand that particularly in South Africa, architecture is being taught the way it was today, the way it was when I was a student. And what I'm saying is that there needs to be a complete and utter paradigm shift in the way that we understand architecture. Once you realize, or you point the finger at architects and say it's your fault, then something has to give, something has to change. So what I'm really sort of quite passionate about is bringing a, you know, sort of dismantling tower idea that architects have, that they are these wonderful creators who visualize these beautiful constructs and they get realized. And I think, you know, the way the world is heading is that in actual fact buildings should be designed around a table with a whole bunch of different expertise, including sociologists, physicists, and, you know, as well as engineers and architects and everywhere else. But sort of again, bringing in that sort of systemic understanding of design and problem solving. And it's not really about creating objects anymore. That's like, the time for that is gone. Yes, there are huge aesthetic and meaning and identity responsibilities on the architect to create beautiful buildings, but beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and that is a sort of subjective debate that can go on forever. So what you can do is you can justify design through process, through an understanding of what it is that you're doing and how you arrive at that solution. And provided that there is a sort of a sensitivity and a sensibility about aesthetics and about composition embedded in that understanding, then you should be okay. And that's kind of like where I try and focus my work and is my teaching, that I try and bring to students a new methodology of architecture whereby they can actually explore these contextual issues in a lot of depth, and out of those issues they can draw a systemic understanding of how the building needs to operate and what it needs to produce or do or provide, and those considerations are then the generation of form, and through that generation of form the architect brings a sense of identity and meaning and purpose to that resolution. So it's a quite a different kind of approach where there's a lot less ego involved and a lot more subtlety in sort of the generation of form and identity in architecture. Students are so keen to learn this stuff, and that's in South Africa there just is not the capacity amongst the teaching staff. They don't know. They know what they were taught, and they've practiced the way they've taught, which is about meaning and identity and art and creativity. And what I'm saying is, that's all critically important, but there's absolutely another layer that has to, everybody's running around designing vehicles with square wheels. But they've got square wheels, and they don't actually work. We've got office buildings in Joburg that in winter, they get heated up in the morning, and they get cooled down in the afternoon, because they're so designed not around performance, around the idea of creating comfortable spaces inside with an outside environment that you have to understand and take into cognizance. So, I see that outside environment as a resource, as a system of energies to use, to harness, to create comfort inside. Whereas most architects see it as kind of like an enemy that has to be shut off, and then we switch heaters on and we switch air conditioners on and we make this false environment on the inside, and that's not necessary. There is this filter, this relationship that could be developed between the inside and the outside of buildings, between the internal climate and the external climate, in terms of creating comfortable spaces that meet human needs for comfort. That's the biggest problem. That is the biggest problem, is that we actually need we need to intervene on those buildings in very, very clever ways, and that's not always very easy. But it can be done, and that's actually where I want my research to start going, is to start saying, okay, it's easy to design this perfect city on this green field site and reimagine how Joburg could have been developed, but this is how it is now. So how do you apply the same thinking at a building scale, at a room scale, at a street, a neighborhood scale, at a district scale, at a city scale? How do you kind of reimagine the current infrastructure being messed with, eroded, sort of attacked, modified to be more responsive to the overall systemic understanding of what's going on? So that's kind of like where I'd like to take my work. The way I often talk about my buildings is that they sit in a landscape and they relate to that landscape very much, or they evolve in that landscape during the design process, very much the way an organism evolves in its ecosystem. So they tap into the available resources, and they concentrate on cyclic relationships, and these things are exploded up from an ecosystemic, a traditional ecosystemic understanding to a more sort of to a more human contextualized ecosystemic understanding. So things like money, aspiration, purpose, meaning form part of that contextual relationship that the building positions itself within and responds to. There was one project where the client came to me and his objective was to have a house that was independent of the city council and was autonomous, what we call an island home. And because he didn't have trust or faith in the city council in the years to come. And that was a statement at the beginning of the project. By the end of the project took 2 years to design, and by the end of the design process he was a completely converted environmentalist, and he had taken on all of these other softer tissue agendas about responsibility, custodianship, and etc., etc. So that was really a fantastic kind of process. Also, he was a very wealthy man, and he spared no expense at achieving his objectives, which is an incredibly high performance house. It was a private house, and one which was autonomous, so it makes its own electricity, it makes its own water, it treats its own waste, etc., etc., etc. And it's in a suburban context here in Johannesburg. And so that was like quite an interesting project, and what was really fascinating about that was the kind of aesthetic ideals or the aesthetic identity that of that design process was very much a performance-based concept, again realized. It could have been realized in any number of ways. So the way it gets realized is influenced or shaped or sort of pushed by both my sensibilities and the clients. So it was quite nice in that sense, and yeah, and it's a nice, for me it's a nice project, and I was really, really fortunate that to be given that opportunity to actually work something through right to the very nth degree of realization. So it was a very satisfying process, and kind of like it was from there that my interest then moved on to cities, because I kind of like felt like, okay, that's cool, nailed it, time to get on. You know what I mean? My interests have quite largely, or are busy largely moving from understanding buildings in this way to now starting to look at cities in this way. And in fact, I'm kind of like starting to research and focus on the idea of how we as people can develop sustainable cities which respond to this contextual understanding of ecosystemic, you know, in terms of natural environment, human-made environments, things like politics and economics. I'm very interested in biomimicry, and there's the biomimicry. There has been a city designed upon biomimicry principles. It's also been used in Cape Town for the upgrading of certain areas. So those kind of projects one finds really, really interesting. I don't, I kind of like take a slightly different slant to that, because as an architect, my interest lies in a range of influences and aspects that drive a design process. Mimicry is really, really very specifically focused upon a specific kind of methodology, whereas I've kind of developed my own methodology, which would include things like biomimicry, permaculture, sustainability as understood in various different ways. So yeah, I mean, there are lots of architects that I look up to, although I'm notoriously bad at remembering names of projects and people. I mean, Norman Foster is somebody who I think I really sort of kind of like admire the way he approaches projects. Ken Yang, Renzo Piano. So these guys kind of have they have a very natural way of developing a design, which in a way, one kind of conceptual understanding or solution for a project enables a whole range of different factors or considerations that they are encompassing. And I think that that's a really kind of nice architecture. What I really kind of like push against, what I really don't like, is this very sort of form-based, the creative impulse that many architects have to build monuments, basically what I call monuments to their own egos and their own creativity, and these sort of sculpturesque objects. And I don't see architecture as objects in space. I see them as an organism that ties into an ecosystem in a whole range of different ways. And it's very kind of like monodimensional to think of it as an object. And very seldom do I have an idea of what the shape or form of this building should be. It usually evolves out of a process. And I'm very interested in that, in how the aesthetics and the design look and feel can actually evolve out of a sort of a methodology which is very much kind of like science underpinning, the science of the performance of buildings and the ecology of buildings, underpinning a kind of a conceptual, artistic, personal impulse to generate. You always have some kind of a personal idea of, the same solution could be solved that way or this way, but you prefer this way because I prefer to think of that in terms of what other options does it open up, what other design opportunities does this option or that option open up. But nevertheless, there's always some kind of materiality or sort of ideology or philosophy or aesthetic that underpins the sort of objectives that you're aiming towards in the design of a building. My whole theory about cities that I'm busy working on basically kind of like looks at natural ecosystems and how organisms evolve within those ecosystems, and whenever conditions change, you'll see certain species die out, or certain species will proliferate and prosper and flourish up to a certain point, but then when they reach over a critical point and they start actually damaging the ecosystemic whole, they start to die back. So nature has these wonderful sort of self-governing mechanisms. So, and it's basically all built around water. I mean, essentially that's the bottom line of human existence. So, in a physical sense. So my kind of whole idea is really looking at cities in that same way. So, for example, municipal boundaries would be demarcated by watersheds, and each municipality would be responsible for the management, the collection of rainwater, the management of that rainwater, the recycling and the delivery of fresh water to its own watershed area. And as soon as development had reached the limits of that water carrying watershed area, that's it, that's the limit to human development in that area, and now another watershed must be colonized for further human development. So you never overstress any one system too much. And then other cute little ideas, like at the bottom of this watershed would be the collection dam where all this water sort of ends up, and the municipality offices would be located right there. So the first people to know about the water going bad or starting to smell wrong or so this sort of thing would be the municipality themselves, and their biggest functionality is in fact the management of the quality of that water. So if human development was organized around the principle, for example, of water, and land boundaries were organized with that sense, we could start looking at sustainable cities. And similarly, movement and transport in cities. I mean, the easiest way to walk up a mountain is to walk up the way water comes down a mountain. You follow the river up. And similarly, our sort of transport and the sort of the mechanisms by which we sort of move stuff around in our cities can be reinterpreted. The way we do roads, the way we do electricity, obviously should be. There's this idea that in biomimicry, for example, that solutions should be nested and modular. So the idea of every single building being a power plant, producing electricity, using it, storing it, delivering it, sharing it, that's the sort of sensible, like plants in a natural environment. They all have symbiotic relationships with each other. They all provide services to each other. And one can imagine that same sort of thing in buildings and cities where one actually focuses. It's sort of systemic thinking where, because since the Renaissance we sort of developed this silo thinking where now you're either a doctor or you're a lawyer or you're a biologist or you're a physicist, and what we're sort of realizing now is that actually what's much more important is the relationships between elements rather than the elements themselves. So systems thinking is now much more concerned about understanding those relationships, and I think for me that's what makes good architecture, good urbanity, is understanding a systemic sort of system that whole entity sort of develops and lives within and propagates and is designed around, and those are the sort of design considerations. So kind of like that kind of says it all in a nutshell there.
We are from Africa. We do satellite monitoring, crop monitoring through satellite imagery. We monitor crops on a daily basis, where we can actually tell you if there's any stress on your plants, crops on a daily basis.
How do you manage that? How do you tell whether there's stress?
We do through infrared imagery. We can actually, if a plant's in stress, we can actually pick up, when a plant's in stress, it will actually radiate more infrared than a plant that is not under stress. So we can actually pick that up before you know anything about stress on your plant. We can pick that up and we actually inform you, go out to the specific place in your crops, and you can actually see what the problem is.
What sort of thing would stress your plants?
Water, not water, insects, not enough pesticide or fertilizer. There's a lot of differences, a lot of problems.
Do pesticides stress a plant quite a lot?
Yes, it can stress, but we're usually down now doing microbes on plants. We don't use actually pesticides, but we can monitor it.
You say you do microbes on plants. Will you explain that?
We're just putting back microbes with, if the ground is not old ground, we put in microbes back in the ground to get it more fertilized and get the good stuff back in plants, and then we monitor the plant.
Will those microbes live in polluted soil?
It will live. It actually will make the ground good. Yeah, that's very good.
Do you approve of fertilizers and chemicals?
No, we don't approve it. We are all biological microbes. We're not on the pesticides and fertilizers.
Do you believe that it is impossible to feed the world without chemicals and fertilizer? It's possible to feed the world with no.
Yes, it is.
Say it in one sentence.
It's possible to feed the world without fertilizer because there's microbes is in the ground and you can just use it. You have to just put it back in.
They're saying that microbes are the source of almost all immune systems.
Yes. When they went to Mars, they were looking for microbes, and that's the first sign of living material. So we're just putting it back in soil and make stuff happen. Make it bigger and juicier and put it back in.
Can I leave my bag here a second? You go and film that
No
dog,
problem.
that winning dog. Where do you get your microbes from?
From Microbial. Microbial is a South African-based company, but they've got factories in United States. They manufacture it there, and we're getting it from there. But it's a company that was first developed in South Africa, but they doing all the production in America. First in the world, the best.
I wanted actually, where are you based?
In Johannesburg. We're based in Johannesburg, but this little company is in George, the Western Cape.
And if I want to do a follow-up on this one, because this is interesting to what we're promoting.
No, my name is Gerard Kuhn. Yeah.
And this is microbiomes.
Biofarm Solutions, we use just organic and microbes. No pesticides, nothing. And we actually have the world record for onion production in seed. Yeah, just on microbes. We're doing a lot of on this products in the Eastern Cape on citrus. Because export, they don't use any chemicals. And then we monitor with satellite imagery.
Are farmers surprised when they start using microbiome and find their crops so good?
They're surprised. They think fertilizers will do that, and then they use microbes. Boom. Much more juicier.
Do they ever go back?
Never. They're first a bit skeptic about the product because we've got a little bottle of microbes about 100 millimeter. We can treat about 5 hectares with that. There's about 10 to about 12 billion microbes in that little bottle. And it can stand heat with up to 80 degrees. So it will last and last and last. We actually do chicken manure where we coat it with microbes and then put it in fertilizer. First in the world as well.
And then how do they apply that for microbiome?
How do they apply
They
it?
put it in the watering system.
In water systems, yeah, sprinklers, you put it in, it's all liquid based, you put it all in water systems and pops your uncle.
Then they never use poison again.
Never. We can treat pesticides with natural stuff, natural elements, no pesticides, nothing.
Wow.
You can actually taste the difference in oranges, organic versus it's sweeter, better, the color is more beautiful. I'm actually very enthusiastic about it.
Yeah, no, that's real
Yeah, with the satellite imagery, it's very nice. You can see actually the stress on a plant. That's see it. We will show you. We will call you. Listen here. There's some problems in your.
Even though you don't know the person, you can see them from the satellite.
You can see it from a satellite. It's all infrared, and you can see on that spot. There's that tree. It's under stress. Maybe it's some different chemicals they use, or there's some water working, so you can point it to that direction. Go and see what's the problem.
Wow,
Yeah.
amazing. All from infrared.
All from infrared, yeah. Because the green plants taking more light and sending out less infrared. When a plant's in stretch, it will take less light and send more infrared, so you can actually pick that up. And now we can also see the evaporation of water. If there's less evaporation in your fields, dam levels, we can monitor that as well for your food satellite imagery.
Are you noticing a lot of stress now where the plants are all being hit by drought?
Yes, you can see that.
It must be like a
Yeah.
danger signal to go.
Danger sick, but when you irrigate them, no problem with that.
It's funny, they actually have done tests
Yes.
on plants using lie detectors. And the plants that have something cut off, they found out what plants like and what they don't like by watching their stress levels. From lie detectors with the infrared would have been easier for them.
Much easier.
And one thing they found out was that plants knew they had a control thing. They said everybody must walk into this building. One of them was going to destroy their plants. Plants knew when that person entered the room, they all were very stressed. They knew that he was the one who was going to do the destroying of the plant in front of the others.
It's nice. And with this we can do scouting to a specific plant, take pictures of it, upload it to your system, and you can actually see the difference before and after with your satellite imagery. It's nice system to have.
I'm going to keep in touch anyway.
Definitely, yeah. Too is actually it's a fundi on microbes. I love working with this GIS software because I'm a farmer of heart and I love doing them, but I'm passionate about ground.
Do you grow your own food?
Yes, I do. I love doing my own food, plant my own food stuff.
And you reckon it's actually quite easy?
It's quite easy.
Yeah.
You don't need all expensive stuff to grow your own. You've got everything in the ground. You just need to use it. The citrus, oranges. Let me just go back. Problem on your orange, there was it was called Phytophthora. It's like a what do you call it? Sickness on your trees. That little, and that little there was no irrigation. It was problem with your irrigation pipe. So you can actually pick that up on your satellite imagery. Just let me show you this. Here's the factory in the US, where they develop for microbial. All the microbes, no factory. It's all in America, but actually I'm not in. What can I say about that? Passionate.
keep away pests from the plum trees, so they don't have to spray anything.
Yes, and that's companion planting, and if they put
Companion
marigolds
planting, yeah.
and calendulas, and I mean, I don't know about those dianthus, but look at those extraordinary artichokes there.
Yeah, amazing. Older, like the young guys, are very ignorant.
Yeah.
But the older, yeah. But he probably prefer a few Zimbabweans because he can speak Shona and local Zimbabwe.
I wonder why they put the plastic there.
Weed control maybe.
Oh, look at this. This is a insect wall, or an animal wall, that is so clever. It's based on the hedgerows in England, or I suppose in Europe.
Yeah.
And each of those sort of areas could be a little house for wild mice or insects and bees, and I suppose maybe not bees, but little birds. I don't know about the companion ship here.
They get used to going here, don't they?
Yeah. It's delightful. Yeah. But look at the beautiful
So cute,
texture.
yeah.
I mean, the shapes and forms, and it's one of the nicest I've ever seen.
Yeah.
I saw one of these. I saw one of these in at.
Like it's an apartment for insects and rats.
There you go.
It's so extensive, isn't it?
Yeah. And I also like maybe very thin. Stunning. This is wonderful. This is flowers that I planted at Monkey Valley entrance. They're part of the carnation family.
Do they do bees?
Maybe they do. It's all strange.
And pansies, they're also the edible flowers. So lots of organic, beautiful organic salad. Can I put this in front? To be eaten, and then it attracts the pollinators. And then maybe instead of the vegetables, they go for the flowers and actually pollinate and create the abundance. So it is a strange one, I mean, but they're being edible flowers. I think the dianthus is. That's little violets, which are also beautiful edible flowers.
Chives, is that chives?
And then there's chives in there, and
what is
funny,
the flat
it
leaf
looks
ones?
Well, that also looks
taste a
like
bit.
it's primulas.
It looks like foxgloves. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just getting the gist of it.
Yeah.
But now I want to, in amongst this garden, can you talk to me about the other things?
Talking about
Yes,
the drift.
drift, okay.
Oh, and the right, what right have people to spray poisons?
Yeah.
And I mean, it's making other people sick. It's not fair.
So there needs to be some kind of control, and the looking into the poisoning of our earth, and then the poisoning of the human being, because we're the rights of the Constitution to clean air, clean arable sand or food, and the water. And if you think that the spraying is affecting all the elements that bring and create life, it's just a thing. And to think that you've been so severely affected by the spraying in this beautiful area. So the beauty, if it is then edible, has been a source of poisoning.
Yeah.
Where this beautiful garden at Boschendal shows just the abundance that can be there, just with a little bit of care and no spraying, utilizing compost and putting back in the whole
It's not even nutrition.
Yeah, there's enough food for everyone twice over on this planet, but like you said, if what's happening? I mean, what are we doing wrong? And yeah, it's a difficult one. I think if the key should be if everyone could just maybe stand together and start knowing what's going on in the soil in your backyard, and applying earthworm, for instance, applying earthworm juice to your vegetable garden. I mean, if the plant's healthy, then take for instance the cell wall of a plant. It's made out of a combination of elements, but calcium being the main one. If you look only into your calcium needs of the plant, then it's difficult for diseases and fungi to penetrate the plant, so they just move on, and small insects. So it's basic things. It's science that's going to win this, and knowing your soil and knowing your plants and knowing how it works. And if everyone can get like a base crash course on how it works, then you won't go to your Agrimark and buy something that kills the snails, and obviously then kills the earthworms and kills everything around it, but you've got your one lettuce. I mean, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and also it ends up in the sea. Now the sea is dying.
Nutrient leaching, yeah.
80% of all chemicals and hair shampoos and soaps, everything ends up in the sea.
There's a in obviously the sea, you've got that whole conveyor, the plankton conveyor, the chlorophyll, what's that? The algae.
Phytoplankton.
And if they die off, the whole system will shut down.
At the moment, the latest study that was released about 6 weeks ago, results of a 30-year study were released that said that at the present rate of decline of oxygen levels in the sea and the phytoplankton decline, there will be no oxygen in the sea virtually by 2030. And since they produce 50 to 65% of all the oxygen, including the land oxygen, that's probably going to have a big effect on us. We believe that the whole advantage of organic farming is that the one thing that can change that around, the fastest way we can take the carbon dioxide out of circulation and cool the planet, is to build up the microbiome underneath the soil. And they can only do that if you stop poisoning them and stop leaving them bare and get stopped.
Exactly. Yeah. Like for instance, making compost, like everyone did 100 years ago. It's making compost and getting that in your soil. Compost produces a acid called humic acid, and humic acid is one of the most important acids that we need. And what it does, it holds everything together. So now when it starts raining, everything just stays where it is, and everything doesn't wash out and move into the rivers and the rivers into the sea. So the whole thing could be just compost. Just one thing could change 20%, 30% of the whole system. And composting, I mean, what's so difficult about making compost and using it and eating healthy vegetables from that?
It's almost impossible to make compost if you use genetically modified food, because it doesn't break down at all. The bacteria don't like it any more than our bodies.
Yeah. Look, you have to remember there's good GM and then there's bad GM. I've seen good GM where they, like for instance in India, they had a bacteria that sort of attacked the pawpaw. I don't know what's a pawpaw in English.
The same thing.
Is it a pawpaw? And what they found is they genetically modified the fungi that's doing that, and they induced that in an early stage into the fruit. But when it was at a natural stage and you would eat that pawpaw, it was almost at a toxic level. But inducing it in the beginning and putting that fungi in the seed from the beginning, it sort of the pawpaw was now available for the people to eat again, and it was at such a level, at such a holistic level, that it was a good GM.
On the whole, there's no such thing as a good GM, because they said the same thing about the same one that perforates the stomach lining of beetles. They said it was too small to perforate anybody else, but at the moment there's a condition called leaky guts in cattle.
Okay.
30% of animals die from it. and it also goes into humans, it's also creating our food intolerances. And it's because it isn't what they say, it isn't so harmless. And it actually creates a condition of leaky guts in everything. And that means that undigested food is passing directly into the bloodstream. It's causing the food allergies and it's causing the leaky gut system syndrome.
No, point taken. I mean, yeah, I think everything should be researched, and you seem like you do your research, so I like that.
Thank you.
This is her baby. They're doing all of this vegetables. I'm taking on a complete organic production area. So this is the aesthetic area, and then there's a production area that I'm starting, which is like this but more intense organics.
And will you use the shade cloth?
No, I'm going to do it in old school way.
Oh, okay. Will you use the above the ground system, or will you use the in the ground system?
What do you mean?
Well, I noticed lots of people put these poles and they build it up and they put it slightly higher above the ground.
Oh no, in the soils, like I said, old school. Like we even gonna plow with horses and stuff like that.
Oh wow! Okay.
Yeah. It's just down here. Well, behind this poplar sort of forest, there's a 2 hectare.
How many hectares is this garden on our
This and this included is about 2.5.
Wow.
Wow.
And does it produce quite a lot of food? Have you got any idea?
It does produce lots of food, but what this garden is about is what she wanted to do is to show the whole effect of permaculture and how animals and the whole system can work together. So this works, but this is not sort of put together for production. It's put together to display a model of permaculture. Yeah.
But where do all the vegetables go?
So everything that you eat or drink in this restaurant or the werf, that's where that go, and then external restaurants and chefs.
So you are selling it out as
Yes. For instance, we're struggling to get potato seeds because the potato industry had a big knock because of the drought. No, because I may be wrong, but this is my theory. But all the water that when the world started is still in circulation. It can't go out, so it moves around. So the water and everything moves around, and I think the water is now going to. There is going to be areas that's going to struggle and become sort of desert-like, but I think there's areas that will get more rain than what they expected to get. The problem is not the weeds and stuff. The problem is a fruit fly that comes in and stings and lays his eggs. So you can bait them, and you can. We've actually did a two-day seminar now with I consider one of the best scientists alive, and they and a company called Real IPM. Her name is Jean. Not sure her surname, but her name is Jean, and they're doing amazing work with fungi. So what they're doing is they're growing fungi that attacks insects. So the fungi will literally live off the insects and eat them from the inside. And so you'll have aphids or whatever, and you spray this fungi over them, which is a natural thing. And they sort of sit onto the insect, and they literally just goes into the cracks, the exoskeleton of the animal, and they start just living. And a few days later, that same insect will sit there, but if you look closely, it's sort of almost like when you left bread in the fridge for too long. It's moldy. It's just coming out of the insect, and that is the next step. Is taking biology.
And there's no effect on us. It's not going to suddenly become the dreaded killer.
It's actually going to make you. It's almost a biotic. So no, it's a good thing. So that's where we're moving to. What people sometimes don't understand that there's a. I myself, I'm sort of I'm a tree hugger in a way, but we have to embrace science. And there's lots of stuff out there that says, no, just mix this and mix this peel with this and spray it there. But I mean, you're talking about a 200 hectare, 240 hectare fruit system. where there's multiple and multiple layers of this fly. So it's really difficult. For the home grower, yes, I can believe that something like that can work, but on a massive scale, and that's why I take my hat off for these guys and for the CEO, which is the main sort of seed planter in us. But what he's doing is he's taking part in a system where we move from the conventional, and we're starting with we've started with pigs, and we're taking this whole thing into what it was, but we're doing it on a massive scale, and we're doing it on a scale that works and that is profitable. That's the main thing, because it's sustainable agriculture. So even Jacques, the guy that's responsible for all the fruit trees, he's an amazing guy, and he's following science, and he's moving from biological, and everything is moving. So I'm very excited. We're in a very interesting time, actually. There's still guys out there that does the wrong thing, and sometimes that pays, which is the sad thing. But there's big influential people out there that's making a difference.
I think, yeah, just too late. It's potentially
the damage is done, and I don't know. I think I don't know if you want that on camera,
yeah,
but
please, yeah.
I think if not all of the farms tomorrow will start doing what we are doing here, it's gonna crash and burn.
Planet-wide, you're talking about.
Yeah.
You influence your neighbours. Can you talk to them?
You can. I mean, we did the seminar, and farmers from all over came, and you saw this one guy. I laughed when I heard it, but and one of the breaks, I walked out and I went to the bathroom, and he was on the phone, this farmer, and he said, "No, stop all the Roundup. You can't believe how these guys are going on about this chemical. Stop it now." Wow. And it's amazing. And that's because of the science and people coming forward with
It's actually banned in a whole lot of countries since last year.
Yeah.
Roundup.
Yeah.
That's great. So there are
So
some
it's
good
moving,
things, yeah.
but we have to move quick. That's the thing. There's guys that says that we're not going to see 2050. So we need.
And that's happening because of the chemicals.
Excuse me?
And that's happening partly because of the chemicals, because the phytoplankton are affected partly by the heat, but mostly by the chemicals. And put it this way, the heat is coming about because the biome in the soil is going down so fast.
Yes.
You need the biome here to really, really thrive.
Yeah, yeah.
And don't know how quickly you can get it back. 7 years is almost too long. You know, you've only got 14. You don't want to take 7 years before it can be organic status.
Yeah, no, it's like I don't have an answer. I wish that there's a quick fix here, but we need a mind shift, and we need it yesterday. But I'd love you to meet Megan. She's amazing. I'm gonna go get her quick.
Yeah, and pretty much run this garden on their own.
Are they all organic experts, kind of thing?
I'd say so. You guys could start gardens at home now, chemical-free.
Plants, and I don't want. If the insects doesn't want to eat it, I don't want to eat it.
That's a good change.
That's a nice attitude, eh?
I mean, yeah, they're obviously more sensitive than I am. So, well, I think I am more sensitive than they are. So I don't know what it's going to do to my system if they don't want to eat it. So.
Well, that's what GM. You know, GM, the bacteria don't eat it.
Wow.
Her husband is a permaculture farmer. He's actually Mr. Permaculture of Africa, basically, in my opinion. And I film him a lot, you know, because I've been for a long time.
He's a sphere.
Squin, he's doing organic. He's doing organic bread, and he's starting to get it out to farm staff and everyone.
But where does he get his flour from?
From a guy called James Moffat from Bloemfontein.
Where does he get it?
He grows it. He grows organic.
Is he the only one who grows it?
Yeah.
So there is organic.
Eureka, is that non-organic? That's organic.
I don't know.
No,
well, it's not GM.
It's not GM.
So they also want to bring out organic beer and everything. And he came to Cape Town, and he's going to see if he can divert all the farmers into that model.
Really?
Okay, all right. Boshendal was recently bought up by new investors. who are very passionate about the environment and have based the new Voshendal ethos very much upon sustainability. So there have been some major changes recently and a very big swing to supplying organically grown produce, eggs, beef, chickens and obviously vegetables. So that was my brief when I started here, was to be able to grow organically grown stuff for all the catering concerns on Voshendal. We're very fortunate to have some surplus. So I have been supplying online organic shops in Cape Town and other chefs and restaurants and hotels, etc., in the area. Yeah, and I think for me the greatest thing about this space is that it provides a platform to educate people about organic food growing. So it's been a very special space and time for me here on Voshendal. For the public, obviously health. I'm very pro using food as more than just nutrition, but almost as a medicine. I think we underestimate the healing abilities of our food, but it goes beyond the advantages of humans. For me, probably the most important thing is that there's very little impact on the environment, and that we're leaving something untouched for our children. I think the fact that we're damaging our soils, that we are losing astronomical amounts of topsoil every year. The statistics are horrific. If we carry on the way we're carrying on now, we won't have good enough soil to grow food in. So we're putting a lot of things at risk, not just our soils, the whole system. We really do not understand how dependent we are as human beings on the agricultural system. And if our food system collapses, I think we're going to be in very big trouble. We don't need them. I think the wool's been pulled over our eyes. We definitely don't need them. We've proven time and time again in organic food growing processes that we have everything at our disposal to grow our food. Plants aren't much different to human beings if they're healthy and their source of nutrition is healthy. They don't get sick. Very much like us. There's no need for chemicals. Look, without getting too much into the conspiracy theories, a lot of our chemicals are based on surpluses and byproducts from the petro industry boom. A lot of technology and chemicals were developed during some of the major wars we had in the early of that left over, I guess. So I think that's where all the nonsense started. And it's about money at the end of the day. Quick buck. Personally, I would love to see more which will enable us to share with others, but I think it goes beyond sharing surplus. It's about sharing knowledge and equipping people and inspiring people. And I think inspiring independence more than anything else. We're too system dependent. If we can take control of our own lives and take responsible for our own wellness, there'd be a lot less drama in the world. I think definitely the inclusion of food growing skills into our school curricula. Definitely. I think it's sad for me to see how few children are still in contact with their food and actually understand where it comes from. I think that's a good start. Children are amazing. Such little ambassadors. If you plant a good seed in a child, you have a champion, an environmental champion for the rest of that child's or human being's life. I would most definitely ban the rake. I believe that we overexpose our soils and it's time to accept that trees lose leaves for a reason and leave them there. They're good for the soil. And I'd maybe ban the straight line too. There's so much we can learn from nature. We need to observe what nature does more and understand how natural systems work. There's no need for chemical. We have everything at our disposal to grow healthy food. Look, beyond just the fact that genetics are being messed with, to me the biggest or the frightening component of genetically modified foods is the glyphosate link. We are too way obsessed and absolutely dependent, or we think we're dependent on herbicide. And we are damaging our water systems, we are damaging our guts, we are exposing ourselves to horrendous carcinogens. Yeah, it's got to go, it's got to end. I think definitely educating our children. I can't express that enough. Definitely more education, environmental education, food education, medicine education. Our children need to know. They need to be equipped for what's waiting for them. That they don't make the same mistakes our generations and before did. Big focus on kids.
Yesterday I released a document that was in relation to, there was a news article came out that the minister was basically trying to play down the costs of solar power. They said that the solar power plants were costing them between 50 and 62 billion over the course of the contract. And as a result it was too expensive, and therefore South Africa was using it to justify the need to move over to nuclear. And there's a whole lot of back-end politics that goes in with that. Anybody that's in the renewable energy industry knows that it's an absolute load of rubbish, because a solar plant, and in this case they're referring to a 100 megawatt solar plant, for us to build a 100 megawatt solar plant costs us roughly 2 billion rand, and therefore it makes no sense as to why you would enter into a contract for 60 billion. Why wouldn't local municipalities, Eskom, etc., whoever, why wouldn't they just build their own plant and pay some people for maintenance, and that's it? And then it wouldn't cost them 60 billion rand, because ultimately renewable, what I proved inside that letter, is a far cheaper form of power. And then in addition to it, I brought into the environmental benefits in terms of the amount of charcoal that is used by coal fire, the amount of water that is used by coal fire, 1.32 liters of water per kilowatt hour of energy, 1.32 liters, ludicrous. 1 kilogram of coal burned for 1 kilowatt of energy, 1 kilowatt hour of energy. I mean, it's absolute madness. So then I went on to nuclear, and I just explained the whole process of uranium and the cost, the CO2 costs that are associated with it. And I summarized basically by offering to show them supporting documentation that proves how much a solar plant costs on a cost sale basis on that scale, which is 100 megawatts. And at the end of the day, we are being completely misled. This has become a political tossing ground. What they're really trying to do is they have an intention, a small group of people have an intention to try and go with a beneficial kind of contract system where other people are making astronomical amounts of money that is costing us, the taxpayer, and also the consumer of that power. We are having to pay for this. They're misleading us as to why they are doing that, and that's what that document was about.
I think it's very important that we have to make sure that we look after the land, the soil, and to save that for the future. We actually borrow, all of us borrow actually the land from our children and from their children. We have to make sure that we hand it over to them in such a manner that they also can make use of that in a sustainable manner.
Are you aware that the amount of oxygen they've just completed, because we do a lot of research for Mother Channel television, and are you aware that a 30-year study has just been concluded that says that the diminishing oxygen levels in the sea caused by increasing heat and increasing pollution, and that therefore they're killing the phytoplankton, the little small plants in the sea, and that means that there's going to be no oxygen in the sea virtually by the year 2030.
Now, I was not aware of this. This is for me something I heard production. In South Africa, 67% of our population is already urbanized, and therefore we need for sure commercial farmers to make sure that they produce food for the market. And that should be on a sustainable basis, and that is something that you should bring into balance. That should be profitable for them, but they also should have to look after the land, the soil, the water, to make sure that it will be there next year again, that we can produce food again. And that is the most important thing for us as farmers, and it is for us a privilege to be in that section of the economy to make that contribution.
Are you yourself a farmer?
I used to be one. At this stage I'm only a small-scale farmer, but I'm full-time in the organization.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Jason, before we talk to the viewers again about what's happening in the electricity world, could you just tell people at home, because we've had a lot of questions on this, about what is a megawatt, what is a kilowatt, what is a watt, how much do people use, what's the difference, what's kilowatt hours?
Okay,
that whole thing.
So I'll run the quick math. There are 1,000 watts in a kilowatt.
Right.
So that's like 10 100 watt light bulbs. There are 1,000 kilowatts in a megawatt.
Right.
1,000 megawatts in a gigawatt.
A gigawatt.
Right.
1,000 megawatts.
Right. So South Africa uses 236,000, something like this, 240,000 gigawatt hours of energy.
Wait, we haven't said what a gigawatt is.
So that's 1,000 megawatts.
1,000 megawatts.
Right. And a megawatt, 1 megawatt is 1,000 kilowatts. So they have a thing called a kWh, which is kilowatt hour.
Right.
So a kilowatt hour is the total amount of kilowatts used over the period of a day. Now, in Eskom's case, it is the period of a day, but it can also be if you burn whatever. So if you take 5 kilowatts, you burn it for whatever, 1 hour, it's a 5 kilowatt hour. It's the total amount of energy used within a time frame, a period.
Right.
But the way that it's reflected on your bill is reflected generally for your daily consumption, averaged.
Right.
So at the end of a month, they will say you've used 486 kilowatt hours. That's your total usage of energy or electricity.
You build for kilowatt hours.
You build in kilowatt hours.
All over the world.
Right. So now what you would normally do, and I'm going to use easy numbers. Okay. So let's say for argument's sake, your bill at the end of the month is for 300 kilowatt hours. You are then charged normally on what's called a tariff, rate, which is normally like whatever, R1.50, R1.80 per kilowatt hour.
Right.
So they would take that, whatever the figure is, depending if you prepaid or whatever tariff code you're on, and they multiply it by your usage, which is the 300 kilowatt hours. And that's how they determine what your electricity cost is.
Right.
On top of that, they generally would add some other services, line lease costs, that kind of stuff. They would add that, but what we're referring to here is electricity costs.
Now, there is about something like, is it 8,000 hours in a year, or something like that.
Okay.
So if you have an installation that puts out 10 megawatts, does that mean it can put out 10 megawatts times 8,000 hours in a year?
Right. So you get viable output. A 10, for instance, a 10 megawatt, or let's use something smaller, a 10 kilowatt or whatever, any size of solar array.
Right.
It will have what we call peak generation, which is over your primary arc in terms of sunlight. Generally, the rule is 15% before those hours, 15% after those hours. Is not full production.
Right.
It's slightly more technical. A solar panel is rated by something called a STC, which is a standard test condition.
Okay.
And what that means is, if you have a 250 watt solar panel, what they do is they lay it over a sunbed, and that sunbed puts out 1,000 watts per square meter. And based on the impact of the sunlight, the amount of electricity it generates, they rate that solar panel. Now, to come back to your question,
Okay.
if you put one of those solar panels at a good position, at a good angle, up onto your roof, and you leave it for the day, in the early morning, say between 8 and whatever, 10 o'clock, you're not going to get full generation.
Right.
So that solar panel, even though it's a 250 watt solar panel, it's not going to produce 250 watts.
Okay.
Because the incidence of the sunlight on the solar panel is not direct. So it will underproduce. It will maybe do whatever, 180 watts or all the way down to zero.
So when you get just to kind of...
So to come back to your original
okay,
question,
okay.
inside of a day, we as renewable energy people, we take what's called an engineering norm, which is we always work with 5.5 hours.
So when we've got a 250 watt solar panel, that is what it, the peak of sunlight, but it might be less at different times of the day.
Correct, yeah.
But to return that to our original question about kilowatt hours per year,
right,
and the relationship between a certain installation and the number of kilowatt
Right,
hours.
right.
So kilowatts to kilowatt hours. People want to understand
what we call about 100 megawatts deployed, meaning that they'll put up, okay, so put it in easier terms, but they'll put up 100 megawatts of solar panels on the ground.
Right.
They're not telling you how much it's going to produce for the day. They're
Right.
not saying, so the expectation generally would be is that you should pick up 550 megawatts or half a gigawatt of output from a 100 megawatt plant. So there's a
Give us the
difference.
numbers again.
There's
We've got 100 megawatt.
So if you've got 100, we work on a standard saying that even though the sun comes up in its daytime for you,
Right.
from whatever 7 in the morning and at 7 at night it goes down, and that's
Right.
12 hours, we don't calculate based on 12 hours. In areas like Dar or these kind of areas, you can calculate on 6 hours or 6.5 hours or whatever. But what I'm trying to say is that we always calculate on a minimum standard, which is normally 5.5 hours.
Okay.
So when I design a 100 megawatt array, my expectation is for it to work for 5.5 hours of the day at full production.
And that would be how many kilowatt hours then?
So if you had
Or megawatt
100
hours?
megawatts that was producing at 5.5 hours, you would have 550 megawatts.
Right, okay, got it.
But that, because there's 1,000 megawatts in a gigawatt, it's the same thing as saying it's just over half a gigawatt.
Right.
But that's production. So, but what they're talking about in the newspaper, which is why we're having this discussion, is they're talking about a 100 megawatt plant, and what that means is 100 megawatts deployed.
Right.
So on the ground, if it's 10 solar panel, 10 or whatever, if it's 4 250 watt solar panels, that's a kilowatt deployed.
Okay.
If it's whatever, it's what you put on the ground, and there's nothing to do with how much power it makes. Now, what the minister was referring to, and what NERSA was referring to in that article, was they were saying that we have been bound by a power purchase agreement, which is what the IPP is. It's the power purchase, but it's power purchase agreement, PPA. And what it is they are bound at a certain rate. So a developer comes to electricity at R1.05
Right.
per kilowatt hour, or per whatever, with R2.80 per kilowatt, whatever their value is.
Right.
So they are basically selling electricity to Eskom. Eskom then signs an agreement saying, I accept that and I will utilize that and I can on-sell that.
Okay. And on the production of that electricity, if it was nuclear or if it was coal, how would the whole kilowatt hour thing work with the...
Right, so they do exactly the same thing. So you don't judge okay, so first of all nuclear, coal, petroleum, natural gas, all of them, they all use steam turbines. Those turbines have a rating, either, whatever, they're 550 megawatts, 500 megawatts. That's their rating, that is their deployed. Medupi is rated at 4,700 megawatts. It means that they have turbines in there that are rated at 4,700 megawatts. So when you switch it on, that will produce 4,700 megawatts every hour it will produce it. So over the course of a day, obviously it's a massive amount of power, massive amount of energy there. But the reality is that if you take a look at Medupi, so Medupi was initially intended to cost 5.4 billion rand in this case.
Okay.
Actually, I think I converted to US dollars, but anyway, so it meant to cost 5.4, I think it's billion US dollars for the construction. It's the largest coal-fired power station in the world. Well, once it's completed, it will be. However, after 2 years, they said no, they were unable to complete it. There was issues with it, and the cost.
Okay.
Now they're sitting on, it's almost year 10. They still haven't completed the plant. It's still not fully functional. It's almost doubled in cost in terms of what they originally stated it was going to cost.
Okay.
Now that is not always the norm with coal-fired. Coal-fired is not as inaccurate as that traditionally.
Right.
But there is a technology that is, the norm, and that's nuclear. Nuclear forever comes in over cost, over budget, over time.
Like the French one in the UK.
Yeah. So the same story. I mean, like everything, whatever you learn originally to meet the cost of production for a nuclear plant is inevitably going to budgets, and it scares people. It scares countries. If you're signing up a deal for 1.4 billion euro and to produce it, in the back of your head, you've got to be starting to worry about. Hang on, this could actually cost us 2.4, 3.4, whatever it is. 100 billion euro, whatever. It's the same figure. In your mind, you know that is not a persistent figure.
Right.
And so there's problems with it. And then aside from the problems with it, a lot of countries in Europe, they export the nuclear waste. Ironically, this country, South Africa, was picked up as importing. We're registered as an importer of nuclear waste. God knows what we do with it.
I wonder.
But that nuclear waste goes somewhere,
Valplatz.
Sorry?
Valplatz.
Okay, so there you go. But I mean, and that's just from one nuclear facility or a group of nuclear facilities in single place, and we're importing it here. But all over the world, there is byproduct. In Coburg buries on site. So that means that even long after Coburg has ceased to operate, that ground will have nuclear waste.
Okay.
But nuclear waste is not actually the big problem, so much the big problem. I mean, nuclear waste is never nice, no matter what you do. But there's other problems. So nuclear has to desalinate the water and to,
Before we go into the other problems, just on the kilowatt hour thing, how long, it's 5.5 hours on average for solar per day for a coal-fired reactor.
No, so they run 24 hours.
They run 24
yeah,
hours.
Well, I mean, they're load dependent, so they're demand side dependent.
They disengage for a while. We've heard about that.
Yes, so that's called wheeling. Is when you have so if you're powering any demand, so any kind of load, at any given point during the time of the day or time of the year, the demand may be higher. So let's say we're powering this house for argument's sake. In the morning, we're all making breakfast in the kitchen, and our demand is maybe 5 kilowatt.
Right.
But then during the day, everyone goes to school and goes to work, and the demand drops right off. Now it's whatever, half a kilowatt. It's just powering your fridge and a bunch of other stuff. And they're using their geysers, and but the exact same thing that happens with this house can be extrapolated on a macro scale for a city, for a province, for anything.
So everybody does the same things roughly at the
right,
same time.
But it makes a variation, so it makes a pattern. So what happens is any power plant, whether it's coal fire or nuclear or anything, they have to gear up to supply demand. But there can be a gap, and that gap can be short. It can be anything from hours up to a few minutes, but there are drop-offs. Now you can't have a turbine that's producing all this power, and that power goes nowhere.
Right.
So what they do is they disengage it, and it goes into a state called wheeling. So they're still turning the turbine, but it's just not producing power.
Okay, and for nuclear, do they do that too?
It's the exact same concept.
So
in
they
fact,
put the rods
nuclear,
in to stop it?
Nuclear, you don't switch off. So you can't really. One of the big problems with nuclear, in fact, this is the big problem that they have in Japan with is Fukushima, is that once you've got your heat, once the production, once the chain reaction has started, there's no switch, man. You can't walk up to a nuclear plant and go, okay, off now. Right. It doesn't work like that.
Okay.
It's a savage beast. You're splitting an atom. Right. So anyway, the net result is they have exactly the same principle. It goes into a state of wheeling. The power is still being put into the actual turbine, but they've disengaged the production.
Okay, so they don't stop the reactor, they don't put the rods down.
No, if they're going into a state of maintenance, then obviously they will cut the output. But at the end of the day, I want you to put it in perspective, and there is really no difference. The reason why nuclear is because it takes less to make that much more heat. You're using a more advanced, you're splitting an atom, which is what's releasing that massive amounts of energy inside of that atom.
Okay.
To flash boil water, I mean, that's what you're doing. You flash boiling water, it's like, woo.
Yes.
But in coal, it's not different, really.
Right.
But you've got to keep that temperature at some constant, you can't walk in there and spray it down with a hose to switch it off.
Right.
Yeah, you can taper it off. And slowly cool it down. But even if you were to shut them down today, like a coal fire, it would take weeks to actually cool down to a point that it's functional.
A coal fire.
A coal fire. Forget nuclear. I mean, nuclear, coal fire, petroleum. It's all the same thing. It's all the same principle.
Right.
It's operating on a heat basis, and the heat is what is evaporating steam, and that steam is driven into a turbine. Turns the wheel, and that's what generates. And the thing that I always find the funniest about this whole thing is that you can understand the basic principle of coal. You heat something up and you're using the steam to turn a wheel. And that's sort of sensible. But when you start splitting atoms,
right?
I mean, it's like one of the most powerful reactions in the universe almost. I mean, immensely powerful. I mean, outside of fission, it's huge.
Yeah.
And you're using it to boil water. It's the concept is crazy. It's crazy. And when accidents happen, they happen. And I mean, if you think about it, in our lifetime, we're already aware of 2 accidents. You've got Chernobyl, you've got Fukushima. There are countless other...
3 Mile Island?
Yeah, this guy, I didn't even know about that. But I mean, there's countless other incidents that happen. But coming back to a nuclear reactor, for argument's sake, they all have a byproduct. So they flush out. There's a huge outflow of hot water. Now, because most of that comes from the sea and they don't really care, they just dump it into the sea. It goes back into the ocean.
Right.
That's why the water is always generally warmer around nuclear reactors.
Right.
But of course, it has a dramatic impact on all the entire marine ecosystem that's around a nuclear plant. I mean, it is devastating.
Okay.
So everything changes, everything shifts, and so that's another byproduct that you have from nuclear. I mean, it's not as bad, obviously, as nuclear waste, but it's right up there. It has a traumatic impact.
Now, you've been very involved in the new storage technologies that are coming on stream. Why? How will that affect this concept of wheeling and disengaging from
right? So I mean, it's like beautiful. It's really beautiful. It's a beautiful thing. There's actually a couple of ways to conquer what we call a base load problem. The base load problem is you have solar power and it's up in the day, but at night there's no solar power. So what happens? And that's the base load problem. And the same with the wind turbine. You've got all these wind turbines all around the country producing wind power, but there are times when there's no wind. So what happens?
Even in Cape Town,
right?
Quite rare.
Well, very rare. Yeah. at heights, yeah. But anyway, it's a problem. Okay, so there's a couple of technologies that stepped into the gap. One of these technologies is renewables called CSP, or concentrated solar power, and they use a type of salt and they go through what's called a phase change. They store the output, so they have all these mirrors concentrate on another name for it is a power tower, but they concentrate on a point of light and it melts the salt and it basically stores the heat.
Right.
And they can utilize that heat for overnight or days at a time. But the principle of storing energy as heat is there.
Right.
And of course, it's well over-engineered. It's seriously over-engineered. You can buy this stuff. It's Israeli technology. The storage technology is Israeli. The Israelis are very good at this kind of stuff.
Okay.
But so if you understand that here we've got these really advanced concepts that people that are trying to confuse you, they throw at you.
Okay.
Like they'll talk about things like how do you store 50 megawatt? What is the base load? And they'll throw concepts at you that
That's why we need you, Jason.
No. But I mean, it's not just me. It's not just me.
Yes.
As complex as they try to make it sound, it actually comes down to a very basic mechanic.
Right.
You know, like you heating up something, and then you putting water through the thing, and that water boils. It boils, and then you understand?
It's a turbine.
And it runs a turbine. It's the
creates
exact
mechanical energy.
Exactly right, and the same principle. And another thing that I also love, I must just say this, is that in most of us, when I was growing up, we did an experiment where we took magnets and we put it around a piece of copper, and you make a little like bulb go on. And it's kind of ironic that we're using the exact same thing. Like I mean, those big nuclear turbines, those big coal-fired, those advanced, those heavy engineers, and it's serious stuff, mainly because of the output of it.
Sure.
But I mean, it is that same basic principle. It's that basic thing of magnet round copper. You know, that's what it is.
Right,
and more advanced versions, but I mean, that's what it is. So okay. Over the whole concept of it.
Concrete's not so romantic.
No. Like if you said to someone, hey, no, we're going to make a big hole here, we're going to fill it with concrete, and then we're going to output, we're going to heat up the concrete so it's really hot, and then that's our storage mechanism. I mean, no, you can't, you're not going to get a BMW like that,
No.
because anybody can do it. So that's on the one thing, and obviously I'm oversimplifying to an extent, but then you super advances in technology, and this is what's just happened recently, is supercapacitors. And supercapacitor is like a beautiful thing inside of every kind of device. There's a thing called a capacitor, and the capacitor stores energy for a short period of time.
In our laptops, in our phones.
Laptops, in most devices, so anything that you've got any retained current. So like when you have to, most people have had this advice before.
Right.
So when they're having a problem with an electronic device, they say unplug it.
Yes.
And then leave it off for like 10 seconds.
And everybody wonders why.
Like why? Like why? Like why must I do this?
Why can't we just put it on after 1 second? Because we're impatient people.
And it's just allowing the internal circuitry and the capacitors to discharge.
Capacitors, that's
right. And so they it comes in various different forms, and mainly used in inverters and that kind of stuff. Anyway, they're a useful thing. And for a long time it's been rumored that the ability, the challenge that you always had with capacitors was you could never keep the current that you put in it. Right. And of course the volume of storage that was available on any capacitor.
So capacitors discharge the current very quickly.
So they take current really quickly, and they discharge current really quickly.
Which is the characteristics of a capacitor.
That's what
as far as so far. And that's what capacitors did, and that's how engineers used them.
Yeah.
But something's changed now, right?
Yes, right. So now they basically went and they did carbon nanotube technology, and they applied it to these supercapacitors. And basically what they've been able to do is they've been able to take a capacitor, and they've been able to increase, first of all, the volume and amount of energy that it could take. Now a capacitor of various different sizes, capacitor could always take a lot of energy, but they were never able to keep it for a long time. So now you can keep the energy on a supercapacitor from anything between 1 kilowatt hour, 50 megawatt, you're able to keep for up to 14 days.
Right.
And that's seriously
14 days
14
instead
days.
of 10 seconds.
Instead of even less than 10 seconds in some cases, but yes. So all of a sudden now you have a device that people would have loved to, for many years, everybody wanted to use a supercapacitor for some storage.
Right.
But the ability to, it just was too fast, it was too transient. You couldn't make it stay, no matter what you did. You couldn't keep the power there long enough.
So a capacitor now is more like what we would previously call a battery.
Yes, right. So that's what we call them now. We call them supercapacitor batteries.
Right. But batteries have, the traditional batteries have disadvantages that capacitors don't have.
Of course, yes.
What are they?
So with any battery, you have a thing called an electrolyte. Electrolyte is like the medium, the gel, or the lead acid that they use.
Lithium?
Well, lithium as well, although lithium is slightly in a different class to your typical store types of energy. But the negative components that are associated with this is that there's generally a build-up. So on the plate, so in the terms of when you recharge and discharge, and over time, the battery, it ceases to be able to absorb charge as well, and it ceases to be able to give up charge as well.
Can you clean them? Can you improve them?
You can, in some cases, you can, but if you understand that, maximum lifespan out of, any kind of plate, the buildup is so intense. I mean, it punctures little holes in it. It's finished after a period of time.
As we know from our cell phones and our laptop.
Well, in that case, that's a lithium. So in that case, I mean, generally there's swelling on it, and the efficiency, so the overall ability for it to store power and release power, that becomes compromised over time.
Right.
The benefit that people have of lithium, for argument's sake, is that its energy density is is much higher. So
compared to, say, a car battery.
Yeah, much more.
Much more.
But also it has the benefit that you're able to cycle it a lot deeper. So you're able to use more of a lithium battery than you are, for argument's sake.
Cycle it deeper? What is
cycle. So every battery is rated on the number of cycles.
Recharge.
Right, so it's a full discharge normally.
Right.
And you rate a battery, every battery has a thing called a DOD, which is a depth of depletion, versus cycle life characteristics.
Right.
And this is how we assess generally a battery.
Right.
And so you will see it will have, if you've got a 100 amp battery, for argument's sake, and you use 50%, that's called a 50% DOD. Depth of depletion means you're using half of the battery, and if you cycle that on a daily basis, it will tell you how many cycles, how many cycles you can get off that. Maybe you can get 1,000 cycles, maybe you can get 500 cycles.
Right.
But a cycle is, generally you can use it in a year or whatever. You'll use up a little lead acid battery or 2 years.
Well, like a car battery.
Or like car battery. So a car battery, because you're not using the full volume of a car batteries last longer. But under renewable energy applications, you're using that battery generally on a day-to-day basis. So
you fully deplete it?
Well, not fully, never fully, but down to half or 30%.
Okay.
And then you're putting it back up, and half and 30%. You could fully deplete it, but then, so the more you deplete it, the shorter the lifespan of the battery.
Okay.
So people generally try what we call shallow cycle. You impact as low on the battery as possible.
Okay.
To get the maximum possible lifespan of the battery. And this is true of all technologies, whether it's lead acid, whether it's gel, AGM, lithium, it makes no difference.
Right.
That applies to those concepts, because obviously there's a mechanical process a chemical process is taking place inside of the battery.
Right.
It is decreasing its lifespan based on the way that you're using.
So the number of cycles, very, very roughly off the top of your head, for a kind of car battery or a lithium-ion battery would be...
So on a car battery, you'll do anything between a car battery is different, so forget car battery. A car battery is like a cranking battery. It's designed to give up power fast and take charge fast. But in any renewable or energy electrical storage, you use what's called a deep cycle battery.
Right.
So a deep cycle battery is designed that it can be recharged and discharged more.
Right, because with a car battery, it's quick, and then you use it, and you don't really use it after that.
Yeah, and it's got to yield up a lot. It's got to give up a lot of power very fast.
Right. With a laptop battery or a cell phone battery, so you're using it all the time. You're not just using it for
and so it's over a period. So your impact on it is less.
Right. Okay.
So, but at the same time, normally what you'll get about 1 to 3 years off your cheap lead acid batteries.
1 to 2, and how many cycles is that?
It's using it every day. Okay. So if you take a 100 amp deep cycle battery, you use your 50% 50 amps per day. Recharge it 50 amps per day.
Right.
You will get roughly about a year to a year and a half. Max push, you'll get about 2.5 years off.
Right.
That's what happens.
And a laptop battery.
A laptop battery is a lithium cell, so you'll get properly and take care of them properly, those batteries can last you anything up to 12 years. Lithium is like that. Lithium is a good technology like that.
Okay.
And then you get more advanced lead acid technology, which will last you between 2.5 to say 5 years or 4 years. And these are all your kind of, your American class Trojan batteries, good, well designed. They're specifically focused for like renewable energy applications, and they're good batteries.
Okay. So now we come to capacitors.
Right.
How do they compare with?
Right. So I did a really cool calculation. Anyway, so this guy, I had this comment on our Facebook site, and the guy was saying, okay, and so I'm trying to compare, the differences. So I said, well, that's no problem, man. He says, yeah, it's not viable to go solar because you've got to change batteries. So, and the batteries, even the best batteries, only going to last you 12 years.
Okay.
And now, first of all, you got the concept wrong. I'm not trying to supply a battery system